Silence is not the absence of life, it is the laboratory where life becomes measurable. When the world grows quiet, the nervous system hears its own signal with unprecedented clarity. Breath lengthens. The diaphragm moves like a slow tide. Heart rhythms begin to swing in a smooth arc instead of jittering in choppy waves, and that swing, what scientists call variability, feeds the brain a message of safety. Safety is the master key. It tells the amygdala that alarms can power down, tells the immune system that it can stop bracing, tells the prefrontal cortex that it has permission to imagine possibilities instead of scanning for threats. Silence is therefore not passive. It is an active reconfiguration of the body's electrical conversation, a clearing of the channel so information can move in one direction, from intent to physiology. In the quiet, attention becomes a sculptor. Most days it is scattered light, touching everything and changing nothing. In stillness it concentrates like a laser, and the brain responds. Networks that chatter about me and mine soften their grip, and circuits responsible for mapping space, time, and options light up. Alpha rhythms spread like a blanket across the cortex, and at their edges, theta pulls open doors to memory and imagination. This is not mysticism, it is mechanics. Attention stabilizes oscillations, stable oscillations coordinate distant regions, coordinated regions deliver coherent output. Coherence is the currency of change. The mind is a prediction engine. From the moment we wake, it issues forecasts, how the day will feel, what people will say, who we are allowed to be, and the body follows those forecasts as if they were weather reports. Silence loosens the glue on those predictions. Without the usual collision of noise and habit, the brain can hold many possible futures at once. Call it a superposition of identities if you like. The version of you trained by yesterday, the version of you favored by circumstance, and the version of you sponsored by intention. In noise, the heaviest past wins. In quiet, light possibilities get a vote. It helps to think like a physicist for a moment. A system with strong, rigid interactions decoheres fast, it collapses into one outcome before alternatives have a chance. A system shielded from collision, kept in a calm chamber, can sustain possibility long enough for something unexpected to occur. The human equivalent of that chamber is a mind-body state that reduces friction, slow breathing, relaxed jaw, loose gaze, spine supported, awareness wide rather than narrow. In that chamber, the habitual story does not instantly devour new signals. A thought about who you could become survives long enough to recruit a partner, a matching emotion. When thoughts and emotions synchronize, biology listens. Emotion is not an accessory, it is a broadcast protocol. Elevated states, gratitude, awe, compassion, carry a wideband signal that recruits the heart, lungs, and gut into the same rhythm. The vagus nerve ferries that rhythm upward, and the brain tunes to it like an instrument matching pitch. A coherent body invites a coherent brain. A coherent brain can stabilize a coherent image of the future long enough for the body to start rehearsing it. Rehearsal is not pretend. Neurons that fire together wire together, and the map for an action often forms before the action becomes visible. Athletes practice movements in imagination and strengthen motor circuits, musicians hear notes internally and refine timing, people rehearse calm under pressure and discover, later, that the body remembers. Silence is the rehearsal hall where self-talk becomes self-architecture. You withdraw attention from the familiar loops, and those loops, starved of energy, begin to weaken. You feed attention to a new pattern, and synapses in that pattern sprout receptors like thirsty roots. The brain is not marble, it is clay warm enough to reshape but cool enough to hold form. The body is not a dumb follower. It is a sensitive meter that registers every inner signal and answers with chemistry. A single session of deep quiet can change the ratio of stress hormones to growth signals for hours. A season of practice can change your baseline from hypervigilant to creative. To work at this depth, you do not try to erase thought, you master the pivot. A thought arrives, you notice it without dressing it in argument, you return to breath, body, and chosen image. Repeat, gently, and the mind learns that it can think without being kidnapped by every thought. The present becomes wider. In that width, a new instruction fits, a sentence spoken not out loud but with feeling, a picture held not with strain but with steadiness. The instruction is simple and framed as already true, I am the person who, followed by the trait you are rehearsing. Not a bargaining plea with the universe, not a wish list, but a statement that gives your nervous system coordinates. The body begins to move toward those coordinates with small, measurable acts, less reactivity in a familiar conflict, more patience in a dull wait, a choice that used to require willpower now feeling obvious. It is common, here, to feel a quiet brightening behind the eyes, a sense that the head is spacious and the chest is unarmored. Do not chase it. Let breath move like a tide on a windless night. Track the posture of your tongue, drop it from the palate. Let the exhale extend a little further than the inhale. On that longer exhale, the heart's rhythm smooths, and when the heart smooths, the brain's timing improves. When timing improves, the picture of who you are becoming stops flickering. The system has entered a low noise, high precision mode. Ideas appear that were invisible when attention was splintered. Solutions that once arrived only in showers or long drives show up on demand, because you have reproduced the conditions, silence, safety, coherence, that allow them. Identity is often a constellation of remembered emotions. We say, I am anxious, but we mean, I have practiced the chemistry of alarm so often that my cells expect it. We say, I am impatient, but we mean, my predictive brain assumes delay equals danger. Silence is the moment you stop signing those contracts. You watch the old chemistry try to renew itself, and you let it pass. You supply a substitute, the physiology of calm plus the emotion that matches your new instruction. The substitution feels awkward at first because the body favors familiar doses. Stay with it and the unfamiliar becomes comfortable. Stay longer and the comfortable becomes standard. Stay longer still and you forget what it felt like to live in the old pattern, not because you erased the past, but because you built a stronger present. This is where the word portal earns its name. A portal does not force you somewhere, it makes many places directly reachable. In silence, the range of reachable selves expands. You can access the version of you who speaks softly and is still heard, the one who designs before reacting, the one whose curiosity outlives embarrassment, the one whose health practices are not negotiations but expressions of identity. You do not become this person by argument. You become them by training physiology to prefer the chemistry that supports their habits, by training attention to return to the picture that explains those habits, by training language to reinforce the picture instead of contradicting it. Think of a lake before dawn. Surface ripples carry old wind long after the air has stilled. If you step onto a dock and wait, the ripples flatten, and the lake begins to mirror the sky. The mind in quiet behaves like that surface. It stops replaying the last gust and starts reflecting what it is pointed toward. That reflective power is not escape. It is preparation. You come out of practice and find that conversations bend differently. You do not change others, but the field you bring to them changes what is possible. The future stops feeling like a corridor and starts feeling like a room with many doors, some of which you could not see before because you were sprinting. In the mechanics of this work, time becomes elastic. You can compress a day by packing it with unconscious reactions, or you can stretch it by returning to awareness between tasks. Each return is a microsilence, 3 breaths, a softening of the eyes, the reminder of your instruction, the taste of gratitude without a story. Those microsilences amount to minutes, then hours, and those hours become proof that your inner state is not hostage to the outer scene. Proof is contagious. It changes belief. Belief, Once updated, changes what your predictive brain expects to happen next, and the body follows a new weather report. There is nothing to worship here except the ordinary miracle of a system that can learn. You are teaching your nervous system to recognize a new home frequency and to prefer it. You are teaching your attention to stay with a picture long enough for biology to imitate it. You are teaching your language to serve your becoming rather than your history. None of this requires a mountain, a monastery, or a perfect life. It requires repetition that is kind rather than harsh, precise rather than dramatic, steady rather than heroic. Silence is not empty. It is the most information-rich environment you will ever stand in, because nothing is drowning anything else out. In that clarity, you can hear the faintest beginnings, the first alignment of breath and word, the first cooperation between heart rhythm and idea, the first moment when an old impulse fails to launch and a new choice rolls forward without strain. That is the sound of potential turning into structure. Sit with it. Let it build. When you rise, take a fragment of the lab with you, a quieter exhale, a wider gaze, a single sentence that names who you are training yourself to be, and use your day as the experiment that proves it. Silence also tunes the sense you rarely name, interoception. Beneath the loud senses of sight and sound, the brain carries a quiet map of pressure in the chest, stretch in the lungs, temperature in the gut, chemistry in the blood. In noise, that map is grainy; in quiet, resolution increases. As the internal picture sharpens, prediction errors fall, and the system spends less energy correcting itself. That saved energy becomes attention you can invest. You invest it in a sentence that aims your day, in a posture that broadcasts ease, in a choice that aligns with your future instead of your history. This is not self-hypnosis, it is budget management at the cellular level, fewer alarms, more construction. Breath provides the metronome. Around 6 slow cycles per minute, the heart and lungs enter a resonance that looks like a tide moving through you. Vagal pathways ride that tide to the brainstem, and from there to limbic hubs and cortical gates that decide what gets noticed. In that window, the reticular activating system relaxes its tight filter and allows in signals that match your intention. You have felt this as coincidence. You rehearse a trait and then meet a moment that invites exactly that trait. It is not magic. It is a brain biased toward patterns it has been practicing, a perceptual system that elevates what confirms the instruction you are giving it. The hemispheres make a second bargain in quiet. When inner chatter softens, interhemispheric traffic grows more symmetrical. The analytic and the synthetic stop arguing and start trading. Language loosens its grip and becomes a tuning fork rather than a whip. Imagery stops drifting and becomes architecturally precise. This symmetry matters because complex change requires both precision and breadth, the left to specify, the right to contextualize, the corpus callosum to coordinate. In stillness, that bridge carries heavier loads without buckling, and your options widen without dissolving into vagueness. Memory, often treated like a museum, behaves more like wet paint. Each time you recall an event, the brain opens a reconsolidation window during which the meaning can be edited. Silence lengthens that window by reducing interference. You remember the old scene, feel the old charge begin to rise, and then bring in a new state, the physiology of safety, the emotion you have been rehearsing, the sentence that names who you are becoming. The memory goes back on the shelf slightly altered, same facts, updated chemistry. Repeat, and you are not gaslighting yourself, you are updating the emotional index so the past stops hijacking the present. The immune system listens to this rehearsal too. It does not speak English, but it speaks rhythm. Coherent breath and elevated emotion alter cytokine traffic patterns, nudge inflammation off its hair trigger setting, and tighten tissue repair schedules. You do not command immunity with words, but you can invite it to behave like a builder instead of a bouncer. Builders do their best work when the site is quiet, supplies are clear, and the blueprint does not keep changing. That is what practice provides, a site without sirens, a steady supply of oxygen and micronutrients carried more efficiently because the vasculature is not in perpetual clamp, and a blueprint held long enough for cells to read. Creativity thrives under the same conditions. Ideas prefer low friction and clear constraints. In silence, constraints become visible, not as walls but as edges to push against. You feel where your speech gets small and decide to widen it by one phrase. You see where your schedule collapses and insert the smallest wedge of structure that will hold it open. You notice the first micro-twitch of an old habit and meet it with the first micro-act of a new one. Change at that scale compounds. Days later you find the wedge has become a beam, weeks later the beam supports a room, months later you are living in a structure that used to be a sketch. Skepticism helps. Not the kind that sneers, the kind that measures. You sit, you breathe, you aim, and then you watch life for evidence. Are you less explosive when interrupted? Does sleep fall in quicker because the pre-sleep story has fewer booby traps? Does your body choose different foods without negotiations that drain willpower? You log the answers, not obsessively, but honestly, and you let data teach you how to refine the practice. The refinement is usually toward simplicity, fewer words, clearer feeling, straighter spine, kinder return when drift happens. The mind loves symbols, and quiet gives you room to choose them. A fingertip resting on the sternum can become a cue for coherence. A single word can become a doorway to the future state. A shift of gaze from narrow to panoramic can tell your nervous system that threat scanning is over. These micro-rituals are not superstition, they are handles you can grab when the day accelerates. Each handle carries a stored pattern: breath slows without argument, jaw floats, shoulders drop, the instruction sentences light up, and the next action comes from who you are rehearsing instead of who you reflexively were. Even time of day becomes a tool. Early light quiets melatonin and lifts serotonin, late light tells clocks to wind down. If you stack practice near the edges of day, just after waking and just before sleep, you ride biology's natural transitions. In the morning, you set initial conditions, and the system extrapolates them forward. In the evening, you clean your mental workspace so the night can be used for consolidation instead of firefighting. Dreams will not obey commands, but they will sample what you feed them. Feed them coherence, gratitude without story, a picture that requires no strain to hold, and watch how problems soften into puzzles and then into plans. Silence also teaches proportion. Not everything deserves a response at the same amplitude. In stillness you feel the difference between signals and noise. A true signal remains when you stop arguing with it. Noise needs your argument to survive. You let noise die, and your day simplifies. Action clusters around what matters, and what matters becomes easier to see because you are not fogging the glass with constant commentary. The result is not detachment, it is intimacy with what is actually happening. The question behind all of this is identity. What kind of nervous system are you training yourself to be? A system that collapses quickly into old outcomes, or a system that can hold possibility long enough to select a better one? The training is plain. Enter quiet on purpose. Align posture and breath so physiology speaks safety. Aim attention at a sentence and an image that already contain the trait you are choosing. Add an elevated emotion as the carrier wave. Return, kindly, whenever drift occurs. Leave practice and act as if the new trait were already yours in microways that cost little and prove much. Measure lightly. Adjust gently. Repeat. Soon you begin to notice an inversion. Silence no longer requires leaving life, it begins to appear inside life. The walk between rooms becomes a lab. The pause before a reply becomes a lab. The breath you take before opening a message becomes a lab. Each lab run is short and cumulative. You do not become perfect, you become available, to ideas that were too quiet to survive your old volume, to people who could not reach you through your old static, to futures that required a steadier hand at the dial. And once you have touched that availability, it is hard to forget. The portal stops being a door you must find and becomes the air you remember how to breathe. Silence gradually upgrades the signal-to-noise ratio of your inner life until choice becomes easier than compulsion. You notice the fraction of a second between trigger and response and discover it is not empty after all, it is crowded with alternatives. In that slim interval, the motor cortex waits for orders, the emotional centers wait for a label, the endocrine stream waits for a story. When you hold that interval with steady breath, the order, the label, and the story begin to match your instruction instead of your reflex. This is the engineering of destiny at human scale, not grand gestures but small latencies reclaimed and repurposed hundreds of times a day. As the practice deepens, the body treats stillness like a familiar room. The shoulders descend before you ask. The jaw remembers how to float. The diaphragm takes its time and teaches the heart to write smoother scripts. Coherence becomes portable, you carry it into a crowded store, a difficult call, a commute that used to compress your spine into armor. People feel it without knowing what changed. Conversations that once escalated fall into a different orbit because your field offers fewer hooks for conflict to grab. This is not passivity. It is leverage. You spend less energy resisting and more energy directing. Thought becomes more aerodynamic. The edges that once snagged on every doubt get rounded off by repetition. Imagery gains weight, it stops being a flat poster and becomes a space you can walk through. You can hear the sound a healthier morning makes, feel the texture of a calmer reply, sense the posture of a body that has practiced integrity long enough to prefer it. The nervous system cannot tell the difference between well-rehearsed inner experience and outer rehearsal. In both cases it builds circuitry to support what it encounters most. This is why the pairing of feeling with picture matters. Emotion is the adhesive, it fixes the sketch to the page long enough for anatomy to trace it. Even the way you use attention changes. Instead of hunting for problems, it starts collecting proofs. Proof that a slower breath made a faster solution. Proof that soft eyes widened options. Proof that kindness cost less effort than defense. The brain loves to justify what it believes. When belief shifts toward agency, justification starts working for you instead of against you. The old reflex to find what is wrong fades, replaced by a habit of finding what is working and amplifying it. The external world has not turned perfect, the internal filter has stopped recruiting every glitch into a prophecy of doom. Physiology keeps participating. Glymphatic flow clears waste more cleanly on nights when you close with coherence. Muscles recover with fewer background alarms telling them to guard. The gut sends calmer telemetry upward and receives better instructions downward. You feel the difference not as fireworks but as absence, less friction in ordinary actions, fewer tiny stalls in the day, a sense that you're operating closer to optimal temperature. When setbacks come, recovery has a shorter path because you know where the handle is. You do not wait to feel like practicing, you use the first breath as ignition, and the rest follows. The social world becomes a mirror with more kindness in it. When you hold your center without rigidity, people reveal their better versions faster. They risk more candor because you are not punishing imperfection. Cooperation rises because threat is lower in your presence. Even disagreement improves, it becomes a joint problem set rather than a war of self-definitions. Silence trains you for this because it teaches you to tolerate unsolved states without panic. In quiet you learn that ambiguity is not a fire, in conversation you demonstrate it by pausing long enough for nuance to arrive. You start designing environments that conspire with your intentions. A chair that invites uprightness becomes a consistent teacher. Light that greets you in the morning tells your clocks the truth. Music without lyrics keeps language from hijacking early focus. The desk is cleared, not as ritual but as physics. Fewer cues compete for your predictive brain's attention, so it can spend its energy completing the picture you asked it to stabilize. On hard days you shrink the scope but keep the continuity. 2 minutes of breath, one precise sentence, a memory edited toward neutrality, an action taken from the future identity rather than the old costume. Continuity outruns intensity. The mind's narrative engine adapts as well. You notice how often it tries to use catastrophe to keep you safe and how poorly that strategy ages. Instead of arguing with it, you offer upgrades, stories that acknowledge risk but pair it with capability, scripts that keep dignity without armor, truths that include possibility rather than erasing it. Language becomes clean fuel. You retire phrases that lock the past in place and adopt phrases that describe motion, learning, and choice. The change is audible. Even inside your own head, the voice stops shouting orders and starts giving coordinates. Silence also resets appetite for novelty. When inner static quiets, the world's detail returns. A tree on a street you have walked 100 times looks newly engineered. Faces regain resolution. Work regains texture. You realize that boredom was rarely an absence of stimulation, it was a surplus of prediction. The brain labeled too much as already known and stopped reading the small print. In quiet, prediction relaxes its grip long enough for discovery to happen in ordinary places. Curiosity takes the baton from control, and with curiosity in charge, learning accelerates without strain. There will still be days when you forget. That is part of the design. Forgetting reveals the contrast that keeps you honest. You feel the old chemistry reassemble, the jaw climb, the breath shorten, the thoughts sharpen into weapons. That recognition is not failure, it is an early alarm. The same gap appears, brief, generous, always there, and you choose again. One exhale longer than the inhale. One release of the tongue. One return to the sentence that names who you are training yourself to be. It does not matter that you returned late, it matters that you returned. Each return writes over the habit of abandoning yourself under pressure. Eventually the practice stops needing a pedestal. You can hold coherence while typing, while listening, while walking across a room you used to cross with armor. You can question your own certainty without losing stability. You can plan with rigor and still leave a door open for a better plan to knock. The system you live in, the interlocking loops of sensation, prediction, action, and meaning, becomes easier to steer because you are no longer wrestling it. You are conversing with it. You are inviting it to prefer the chemistry that makes your best behavior effortless. If you listen closely, you can feel a horizon widen that does not require distance. The world is the same size, but your participation in it grows. Silence was the entry point, the chamber where possibility could survive long enough to recruit biology, emotion, and behavior. Now it becomes the backdrop, a quiet hum under thought, a stable clock under action, a patient witness under success and failure alike. What used to feel like mystical language turns practical, you hold a state until it holds you back. You demonstrate to yourself that identity is not a verdict, it is a runtime configuration you can update. And you keep updating it because the experiment keeps paying off in the only currency that matters, how skillfully you can love, build, learn, and recover in the life you already have. There is a moment in deep quiet when the idea of me loosens and awareness stops gripping a name, a role, a history. It does not vanish, it widens. From that wider place, choosing a state becomes simpler than negotiating with circumstances. You pick a direction first, calm, courage, steadiness, creativity, and then let behavior inherit it. State first, strategy second. In noisy hours we reverse the order and wonder why change feels like pushing a boulder uphill. In silence you train the causal arrow the way a physicist aligns an experiment. You set initial conditions with breath and feeling, and you let the system run. Intention gains friction only when it collides with old wiring. That collision is not a sign to quit, it is the work revealing itself. The body sends a familiar chemical request, give me the dose I know, and you answer with a different recipe. You do not argue with cortisol, you outcompete it with coherence. You do not bully adrenaline, you let it spend itself without fresh stories to keep it fueled. You become a better chemist than your habits. Eventually the lab notes are obvious, the new mixture produces cleaner energy, steadier perception, fewer regrets. What once felt like discipline begins to feel like preference. The future you are rehearsing needs evidence, so you feed it evidence on purpose. You gather tiny wins that match the trait you are stabilizing and stack them where you can see them. The brain treats visible wins as permission to allocate more resources, it broadens attention, relaxes threat detection, and increases willingness to explore. Exploration matters because new identity is a territory, not a slogan. You step into situations you used to avoid and discover that your physiology, primed by practice, behaves like a friendly guide. The old edge still appears, but now it functions like a landmark instead of a wall. Silence sharpens ethical sense in the same way it sharpens attention. When noise drops, you can feel the moral gradient beneath choices. Some actions thicken you, others thin you. Some sentences leave residue, others clean the room. You start to prefer integrity not because someone is watching, but because the system runs warmer and smarter when words and actions match. That preference is a kind of immunity, against self-betrayal, against panic bargains, against the temptation to win a moment you would rather not remember. What you practice alone transfers into the microtheater of conversation. You notice impulse rise like a wave and decide to surf rather than crash. You keep curiosity online long enough to receive the piece of information that would have been lost in interruption. You watch how your state recruits states from others and become deliberate about what you broadcast. Sometimes you will broadcast steadiness and receive relief. Sometimes you will broadcast spaciousness and receive honesty. Sometimes, even broadcasting care, you will receive heat, then the practice shows its spine. You stay coherent without shrinking. Boundaries delivered from calm carry a clarity that anger struggles to find. The environment learns too. Objects and places accumulate associations, and you can compose with them. A window becomes a reminder to widen attention. A cup in your hand becomes a cue for the longer exhale. A doorknob becomes the signal to soften eyes and enter as the future identity instead of the old costume. You are not entranced by tokens, you are training a complex system with reliable markers so the transition into coherence costs fewer calories. Low-cost transitions are what allow a practice to outlive motivation. On difficult days, silence becomes triage. You stop trying to repair everything and restore the core loop, breath downshift, body unarmored, picture steady, feeling real. You shave the instruction to its cleanest form, 10 words that your nervous system can understand without debate. You sit for 2 minutes instead of 20 and refuse to call it failure. You act from the state you could reach, not the state you wish you'd reached, and you let reality grade the result. This mercy is strategic. It keeps the practice unbroken, and unbroken practice beats heroic bursts over any long horizon. If grief, anger, or fear surge, you treat them as weather, not identity. You allow their chemistry to express without giving them the microphone. You breathe them through larger containers, the ribcage spacious, the gaze open, the jaw released, so they can complete without recruiting fresh stories. When the wave passes, you do not declare yourself healed, you note the fact that it passed and that you stayed. That fact is a pillar. You can lean on it next time the sky darkens quickly. The deeper you go, the more precise you become with language. You replace always and never with today. You trade I am broken for I am between configurations. You retire, this is who I am, and adopt, this is what I am practicing. The nervous system hears these differences. Absolutes trigger defense, process invites participation. You can feel the body's answer in the way shoulders stop creeping and eyes stop narrowing. Truth that leaves room is easier to breathe. Attention to silence trains you to change scales without losing coherence. You can zoom into the texture of a single breath and then zoom out to the shape of a year. You can hold a feeling for 30 seconds and then hold a project for 3 months. The same mechanics apply: set state, stabilize picture, attach feeling, act in micro, measure lightly, repeat. The repetition is not punishment, it is how living systems learn. The spiral closes, and each pass leaves the structure stronger. At some point you will catch yourself smiling for no good reason. The reason exists, it just doesn't fit the old accounting. The system enjoys running clean. It enjoys solving without rushing, defending without hardening, planning without bracing, resting without shame. This ease is not naivete. It is competence. You train the levers within reach until they move the parts that used to feel stuck. The world remains complex, you remain teachable, the portal remains open. When doubt returns, as it will, invite it to sit in the back row while you conduct the next experiment. Doubt can watch, it cannot drive. You can even thank it for protecting you while you lacked better tools. Then you use the tools. You set your breath to its tide. You place your attention where you want your life to grow. You let gratitude rise without needing a target. You speak the sentence that names the trait you are building as if it were already true in the smallest possible way, and you prove it with the next action that costs almost nothing and changes almost everything. What began as an exercise has become a way to inhabit time. Minutes are no longer debris between events, they are instruments. The air around conversations becomes navigable. Work stops feeding on adrenaline and starts feeding on design. Rest ceases to be a reward and returns to its real role as infrastructure. You do not need a perfect morning or a perfect world. You need a repeatable method to ask your biology to prefer the chemistry that makes your best behavior cheap. Silence is that method's doorway, and every time you cross it, the path on the other side grows more familiar, more walkable, more yours. Practice long enough and attention learns to self-correct mid-flight. You feel it wobble toward rumination and, like a pilot trimming a wing, you make a millimeter adjustment, wider gaze, slower exhale, kinder phrasing, and the course settles. That tiny correction matters because the nervous system stacks moments. A single well-placed adjustment prevents a cascade of stress chemistry, preserves working memory, and leaves enough bandwidth for generosity. You begin to trust yourself under change because you have rehearsed stability not as a rigid pose but as a dynamic skill. Neuroplasticity answers consistency with architecture. Repeated quiet at roughly the same time each day teaches clocks in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, adrenals, and gut to expect restoration as a scheduled event. Expectation is not fluff, it is a metabolic allocation plan. The body diverts fewer resources to sentry duty and more to repair and learning. Synapses that support perspective taking and impulse control strengthen because they are used while the system is calm, and wiring that depends on panic begins to atrophy from disuse. Choice starts arriving earlier than habit, and earlier is where leverage lives. Perception itself becomes more truthful. Under noise, the brain compresses experience into stereotypes to conserve energy. Under quiet, it can afford higher resolution. Colors look less fatigued, edges more honest, micro-expressions more legible. That fidelity is not only aesthetic, it improves decision quality. You distinguish between urgency and volume, between a legitimate deadline and someone else's adrenaline, between a body's request for rest and a mind's old reflex to quit. You stop paying counterfeit bills with your attention. Inner speech evolves from courtroom to workshop. The prosecutorial tone that tries to litigate you into change loses jurisdiction. A builder's tone takes over, specific, iterative, interested in what works. You catch absolutist sentences and exchange them for process language. For now, today, the next 5 minutes, one clean rep, the endocrine system listens. Catecholamines spike less often, cortisol spends less time elevated, and the slow chemistry that underwrites healing and long-term memory gains room. You are not eliminating stress, you are teaching stress to take its proper size. Silence reveals how posture edits thought. When the head floats over the spine and breath moves low and wide, the brainstem receives a message of sufficiency that the cortex cannot fake. From there, options multiply. Planning includes contingency without slipping into doom rehearsal. Reflection includes accountability without sliding into shame. Confidence stops borrowing bluster and starts borrowing evidence, from the last 100 microacts in which you matched behavior to the trait you are stabilizing. The predictive brain loves patterns, so you give it patterns that serve you. A doorway becomes a cue to soften focus, a hand on the heart becomes a circuit breaker for reactivity, the first sip of water becomes a signal to lengthen the next exhale. These associations are not magic, they are cached state changes. You are reducing the computational cost of returning to your best operating mode. When conditions worsen, the cost savings keep you from defaulting to the cheapest habit. Difficult emotions keep their citizenship. Anger retains its intelligence about boundaries, fear keeps its talent for scenario testing, grief continues to link you to what matters. What changes is governance. States that once staged coups now sit on a council. Breath chairs the meeting, attention runs the calendar, language writes the minutes. No one is silenced, but no one gets the microphone forever. This is the practical shape of integration, parts acknowledged, none enthroned. You start measuring time by depth rather than length. 90 seconds of honest regulation beats 40 minutes of distracted coping. 3 precise breaths before a reply outperforms 3 hours cleaning up a reaction. A single evening walk without headphones gives the hippocampus clean input and returns the next morning's focus with interest. The math becomes obvious, small investments placed at state transitions, waking, commuting, pre-meeting, pre-sleep, compound faster than sporadic marathons. The body's learning loops appreciate fair conditions. When you train while calm, motor patterns encode with less noise. When you study while present, recall improves because the brain can find the same state on test day. You begin to pair important work with deliberate quiet not out of superstition but because it marks files with the right metadata, safe, focused, congruent. Retrieval later becomes a matter of reproducing context, which you have practiced on purpose. Relationships inherit the upgrade. You listen for what a person means rather than only what they say. You spot the moment they test whether you are safe to be real with and answer with steadiness instead of performance. Appreciation returns as a daily tool rather than an event. You name specifics so the nervous systems around you can believe you. Trust grows by increments, and the room's collective IQ rises because less energy is wasted on self-protection theater. Work feels different under these conditions. Output rises not from sprinting longer but from reducing state-switching friction. You cluster tasks by cognitive mode, insert microquiet between clusters, and watch error rates fall. You define done precisely to protect recovery windows that are actually used for recovery, not for scrolling. Rest regains its strategic dignity, it becomes the phase in which consolidation, immune housekeeping, and creativity reconnect without interference. If setbacks knock you flat, you apply the same physics at a larger scale. You rebuild from the base, sleep regularity before intensity, light in the eyes after waking before inbox, protein and minerals before philosophy, breath before ideals. You let identity shrink to what you can prove today. You keep a ledger of kept promises so belief has something honest to stand on. Confidence returns, not as a mood but as a record. The spiritual language people reach for around silence turns out to be an attempt to describe ordinary mechanisms working well. Systems synchronize, signals clarify, predictions loosen, agency rises. Gratitude without an object functions like a lubricant for those gears. It widens attention, softens resistance, and makes new input easier to accept. You do not need metaphysics to respect that effect. You only need to notice how your decisions improve when you feel thankful for no particular reason. Eventually you stop dramatizing the method. You sit because sitting keeps you honest. You breathe because breath is the only lever guaranteed to be present at every threshold. You aim because life without aim dissolves into other people's alarms. You feel on purpose because emotion is the carrier wave for instruction. You act in small ways that confirm the trait you are building because confirmation feeds prediction, and prediction steers perception. The loop closes, not as a trap, but as a flywheel. And when the day surprises you, good or hard, you meet it with the same architecture. One deliberate inhale to gather, one longer exhale to settle, one sentence to align, one gesture that proves it. You let the result teach you what to adjust next time. You keep the experiment running. The quiet you once visited becomes the background hum of a system that knows how to learn in public. Potential stops being a promise and starts being a habit. Silence, practiced as a daily craft, begins to feel like high dynamic range for consciousness. The dim parts of experience stop clipping into darkness, the bright parts stop washing out into glare. Sensation regains nuance, and nuance is where wise decisions live. The baroreceptors in your arteries whisper with each pulse, the vestibular system calibrates your balance frame by frame, the fascia relaxes its reflexive bracing, and the brain reads these signals as a green light to allocate attention outward without losing its anchor inward. Under that permission, you no longer sprint toward clarity. Clarity arrives because interference is low. Insight stops behaving like a lottery and starts obeying physics. When alpha and theta knit a stable scaffold, brief gamma bursts can bridge islands of knowledge that used to sit apart. You feel it as the clean arrival of a connection, no strain, no wrestling, just the click of pieces that were always meant to touch. The nervous system tags that click with reward chemistry, not the spiky flash of dopamine-chasing novelty, but the deeper satisfaction of coherence earned. Coherence is addictive in the best way. The more you taste it, the less you tolerate cheap stimulation that leaves residue. You also learn to place challenge inside the container of quiet rather than waiting for life to break the door down. You rehearse a difficult conversation in a regulated state until the script and the physiology match. You put your body into the postures that belong to the trait you are stabilizing and let the endocrine system read your stance like a headline. Shoulders that broaden kindness, spine that carries dignity without armor, hands that rest open even when the topic tightens. These are signals older than words, and your own biology believes them first. Belief spreads backward from posture to thought, not only forward from thought to posture. Patterns of attention change what time costs. Multitasking once felt like competence, now you can hear its hidden tax, a stutter in working memory, a haze over recall, a jitter in mood. In silence you start sequencing instead of stacking. You cluster similar cognitive modes, leave small buffers as state change airlocks, and return to breath each time you cross a threshold. Errors drop, satisfaction rises, and a day that used to feel like sand through fingers begins to feel like engineered flow. You are not doing more, you are wasting less. Silence reintroduces you to appetite that can be trusted. What you want shifts from anesthetics to amplifiers. The foods that keep cognition even. The movements that keep joints honest. The media that leaves attention cleaner than it found it. The company that requires no mask. Cravings that once carried the shape of escape reveal themselves as requests for regulation. You meet the request with the real thing rather than a substitute that sends the bill to tomorrow. The moral dimension keeps deepening without drama. You notice where you have been borrowing against future self-respect and you close those lines of credit. It is not punishment, it is better math. You can feel the physiological relief of alignment the way you can feel a room exhale when someone finally tells the truth. In that relief, courage costs less. You choose hard conversations earlier. You set cleaner boundaries sooner. You repair immediately when you break your own code, because repair restores coherence and coherence is now your preferred fuel. Even ambition learns new etiquette. Goals stop posing as rescue missions and start behaving like laboratories. You do not demand that the future save you, you invite it to educate you. You hold a vector, clear direction, flexible route, and you measure progress by quality of state under load as much as by metrics on paper. Paradoxically, the paper improves. Systems built from steady states outperform systems powered by panic because they recover faster, compound cleaner, and attract cooperation rather than extracting it. Memory and imagination swap tools in this environment. You let memory keep facts and surrender monopoly on meaning. You let imagination generate meanings that fit reality without dragging the past's dust into every corner. During the day, you edit the tagging of old episodes so they stop auto-triggering alarms. At night, consolidation stitches new learning into the fabric of identity without tangling on fear. You wake with fewer splinters and more traction. The body, listening all along, begins to answer with durability. Inflammation that once simmered drops a degree. Sleep stitches deeper because pre-sleep state is cleaner. Recovery protocols finally have something to build on because you're not demolishing their work with chronic microstress. You notice how often the solution to a stalled problem arrives in the first 10 minutes after you restore coherence, not in the 10th tab you open while incoherent. You start trusting that order of operations. Relationships evolve from performance to presence. You quit auditioning for rooms you don't want to live in. You become easier to read because your words, face, and tone agree. That agreement is a gift to other nervous systems. They spend less energy decoding you and more energy collaborating with you. Intimacy regains its native pace, slower than rush, faster than avoidance, steady enough for honesty to surface without being chased. Silence even updates your interface with uncertainty. Instead of treating unknowns as enemies, you treat them as unrendered terrain. You bring light, not noise. You ask precise questions, listen for precise answers, and refuse to inflate guesses into verdicts. Precision without tension becomes your signature. People start giving you the hard problems because hard is not the same as chaotic when carried by someone who keeps a stable clock underneath. Your vocabulary for self-direction simplifies as the practice matures. You keep a single sentence for the day, one that names the trait you're stabilizing in present tense and ordinary language. You pair it with one image that your body can recognize without translation. You pair both with one feeling that opens the chest without effort. Sentence, image, feeling, breath, aligned like instruments before a performance. Performance, then, is just the next honest act shaped by that quartet. On days when pain speaks loudly, physical or emotional, you widen the container rather than deny the signal. You let breath get low and slow enough to cradle sensation without feeding it with narrative. You place one hand where the body asks for it and keep time until the peak breaks. You give pain respect and deny it governance. In that governance shift, dignity returns, even when comfort does not. Dignity is a resource. It breeds choices that pain alone would eclipse. Eventually, silence no longer reads as absence but as structural support, like gravity, like daylight. You do not chase it, you maintain it, the way a musician tunes between songs. The tuning itself becomes part of your identity, someone who can return, someone who can aim, someone who can act from chosen chemistry rather than inherited alarms. That identity does not make you invulnerable, it makes you permeable to what helps and less adhesive to what harms. This is where potential stops sounding romantic and starts feeling mechanical. Inputs: breath, posture, attention, language, emotion. Process: coherence, rehearsal, microproof, revision. Outputs: behavior that costs less and achieves more, relationships that waste less and reveal more, health that stabilizes rather than swings. Feedback: data you can love because it tells you how to improve without calling you unworthy. Run the loop again. Repeat until the new configuration holds you without strain. When the world accelerates, as it will, you keep two promises: you will not abandon your breath, and you will not abandon your instruction. One gathers you, the other orients you. From there, you meet the day not as a storm to survive but as a medium you can shape. And the quiet that began as a doorway becomes the room you work in, the road you travel, the climate you carry, a living proof that without noise, possibility is not fragile, it is fertile. Silence matures into a craft of directing phase, not force. You learn to work with timing the way musicians work with rests, placing gaps that let the next note arrive clean. Between tasks, you let attention slacken into panoramic awareness. During focus, you let it narrow without tightening. Those transitions write a smoother waveform across your day. The nervous system reads smoothness as abundance: enough oxygen, enough time, enough choice. From abundance, creativity and ethics both get cheaper. There is less temptation to grab, less fear of missing the only door. You start to recognize that state is the first multiplier in any equation. The same hour yields drastically different results depending on its chemistry. You can push through with adrenaline and buy output at the price of tomorrow's clarity, or you can organize your physiology so that work feels like alignment rather than rescue. Alignment favors strategies that scale, batching by cognitive mode, designing frictionless starts, ending with an easy next step so momentum has a place to sleep. Quiet is the calibration that lets those strategies stick. Even your relationship with goals reframes. Instead of sprinting toward an abstract finish line, you treat each target as a training ground for a trait. Writing becomes a way to practice precision without rigidity. Conversation becomes a way to practice courage without aggression. Rest becomes a way to practice trust without passivity. In quiet you preload the trait, then you enter the situation and let behavior fall from what you have already stabilized. When the world surprises you, the trait holds. When it doesn't, the trait still holds. The win is portable. You refine your inputs with a gentleness that is also strict. Light early in the day meets eyes that are not already clenched. Food chosen for steady release supports a brain that prefers coherence over fireworks. Movement becomes punctuation, not punishment, a walk to reset oscillations, a few slow squats to remind the spine that it is a column not a coat hanger, a stretch that tells the diaphragm there is depth available. These small acts are not self-care wallpaper, they are state edits that budget energy toward learning and away from firefighting. Language keeps slimming to essentials. You drop slogans and adopt instructions your body can obey. Slow on the out-breath. Soft eyes. Open chest. Act as if. 10 words can move a ton of biology because the biology wants to move, it just needed a clear, non-argumentative cue. You notice how often complicated plans were camouflage for fear, and how often a single honest action, send the message, apologize cleanly, ask the question, resolves loops that thoughts could circle for weeks. Silence teaches how to hold opposites without tearing. You can be ambitious and unhurried, disciplined and playful, boundaried and warm. The nervous system experiences paradox as tension only when the container is small. Widen the container, breath deep, gaze broad, jaw unlatched, and complexity becomes breathable. From there, decisions are not binary standoffs, they are weighted choices where context gets a fair vote. Maturity feels less like armor and more like tensile strength. When fear speaks, you treat it like a specialist on your advisory council. You ask what it is protecting, you thank it for its vigilance, and you redirect it toward scenario planning rather than sabotage. In the same meeting, you invite courage to stay specific. No capes, just the next honest step. Gratitude keeps minutes, not as sentimentality but as attention training toward what is already working. Each part does its job, none seizes the microphone. The result is governance, not suppression. You begin to sense the geometry of attention in space. Narrow, foveal focus is a spear, panoramic awareness is a field. In silence you practice switching between them on purpose. Spear for the sentence, the line of code, the stitch. Field for context, for mood of a room, for detecting the early tremor that tells you to rest before error. The ability to switch quickly without residue is a hallmark of a regulated system. It looks like flow from the outside, it feels like low-friction steering from the inside. The body's clocks appreciate consistency more than heroics. You anchor practice to the same windows, short, honest sessions that never offend your nervous system. Because they never offend, they never provoke rebellion. Compliance begets accumulation, accumulation begets identity. One day you notice you do not have to convince yourself anymore. The chair calls you the way a favorite instrument calls a musician. The ritual is not a cage, it is scaffolding that disappears while the structure stands. Old narratives show up less as facts and more as offers. You can accept or decline without theatrics. When an unhelpful story arrives, this always breaks, they never listen, I can't learn that, you feel its familiar chemistry try to enlist your posture and breath. You answer with the trained state first and with counter-evidence second. Chemistry loosens its grip, facts get room. You are not arguing with yourself, you are introducing updated data into a calmer courtroom. Fatigue changes flavor. Instead of the frantic, dirty tired that comes from fighting noise, you experience the clean tired that comes from fully used attention. Clean tired recovers quickly, dirty tired lingers because it is laced with unfinished alarms. You learn to stop before you cross the line. Stopping is easier because you are not proving anything, you are preserving a configuration that works. The next session starts at a higher baseline because you respected the system's limits. Silence also recalibrates your sense of scale in relationships. Not every clash requires a summit, some frictions melt under 15 seconds of steady presence. Not every tender moment needs a speech, often it needs a quiet witness and a single accurate sentence. You conserve words until words add value. You conserve intensity until intensity is the appropriate instrument. The economy returns dividends in trust and in the speed at which repair can happen. You become a better student of reality. Instead of asking, how do I force this to fit my plan, you ask, what is the simplest state and smallest action that move this forward truthfully? The question is not smaller, it is sharper. Silence is where you hone it. Information that used to hide in noise becomes visible, constraints you ignored, resources you underestimated, allies you overlooked. Strategy improves not because you learned a trick but because you learned to see. There is a quiet pride that comes from running this experiment long enough to gather real evidence. You no longer sell yourself on hope alone, you have receipts. Sleep improved without exotic routines. Conflicts resolved faster without rehearsed speeches. Work product grew cleaner with fewer hours sacrificed to panic. Inside jokes with yourself proliferate, tiny signals that only you notice, markers of a life that is increasingly aligned. The dopamine you used to chase in spikes now arrives as a steady hum of competence. When crisis strikes, as it does in honest lives, the method scales. You shrink to containment and cadence. You breathe in 4, out 6, until the room stops spinning. You pick the one sentence that keeps dignity on the table. You take the smallest reparative action available. You postpone grand interpretations and keep your nervous system from signing permanent contracts in temporary weather. The storm may be large, but you are not small, you are precise. Precision finds doors that force would miss. Over time, you retire the notion that silence is a break from life. It is life at native resolution, less compression, fewer artifacts, more signal. From there, even your ambition evolves into stewardship. You want to build things that stay built, relationships that stay honest, health that stays usable. You get interested in being the kind of person other people's nervous systems regulate around, not because you crave halo points, but because shared coherence is efficient and kind. It multiplies what everyone can do. If you need a single through line to carry into any room, it is this: state before story, breath before strategy, feeling before force. When you forget, remember quickly. When you remember, act small and true. When you act, let the proof update belief. Then begin again. The loop is simple, the art is in running it under every weather. Silence gives you the room to keep the loop honest. And in that honesty, potential is not theoretical. It is what your system does when you stop drowning it in noise and start feeding it clear, repeatable instructions. Silence teaches a friendlier physics of change, minimal input, maximal return. You stop chasing momentum and start designing it. One clean breath before each transition becomes a hinge that doesn't squeak, one precise sentence in the morning becomes a compass that doesn't wander. The nervous system loves predictability more than spectacle, so you give it rhythms it can trust. Trust lowers the price of access to your best capacities, and suddenly, discipline looks suspiciously like ease wearing work clothes. You begin to experience attention as nutrition. Junk attention spikes and crashes, whole attention digests slowly and fuels long spans of clarity. In quiet you curate your intake, fewer hot takes, more clean signals, fewer loops of outrage, more data you can use. You notice how quickly the body reports on the quality of what you consume with your eyes and ears. You choose sources that leave your interior oxygenated instead of cramped. The inner witness, once a thin thread, thickens into a stable vantage point. From there you can observe a sensation without becoming its spokesperson, watch a thought arrive without renting it your whole stage, hear an old belief knock and decide whether the door needs opening. The witness is not aloof, it is generous. It gives every part airtime and gives none a throne. Governance replaces drama, and energy once spent on civil wars becomes available for building. Curiosity returns to its original job, discovery, not defense. You ask smaller, better questions. What is the next action that respects nervous system reality? What is the simplest boundary that preserves connection? What is one variable I can change without waiting for permission? The answers are rarely cinematic, but they are consistently actionable. Action breeds evidence, evidence upgrades belief, belief shapes prediction, prediction steers perception. The loop gets cleaner each month you keep it honest. Co-regulation stops being a buzzword and becomes a lived instrument. You notice how your breath rate entrains a room, how your cadence sets a tempo others can rest in, how your unhurried eyes make nuance safe to surface. When someone else's weather blows hard, you widen your container instead of shrinking your dignity. You allow their chemistry without adopting their story. The respect is palpable, to them, to yourself, to the situation you are both trying to improve. Goals take on texture. Instead of finish the book, you rehearse, show up daily as someone who writes clearly from a regulated state. Instead of heal everything, you practice, close tonight a little steadier than last night. The macro lives inside the micro, and the micro is where biology can cooperate. Cooperation compounds. Months later you realize your outputs look like the kind of life you used to storyboard, only now the frames are real. You develop a bias for closure. Not the brittle kind that slams doors, the gentle kind that frees bandwidth. You end loops the day they appear, the message sent, the apology made, the promise either kept or retired honestly. Each small closure returns a sliver of working memory and drops the background hum of threat. The system runs cooler. Cool systems think better, heal faster, and love more cleanly. Silence also recalibrates ambition's pace car. You stop mortgaging presents to pay for hypotheticals. You still plan, but you plan from sufficiency instead of scarcity, from clarity instead of adrenaline. Plans born from coherence ask less of luck and more of design. They bend when reality bends because they are built from principles, not panic. When setbacks sting, you honor biology first, meaning second. You sleep early. You feed the machine well. You take light in your eyes and movement through your joints. Then you write the narrative you want your nervous system to remember, not a fable about failure, a record of recovery. The body keeps those minutes. Next time, it finds the path back faster because you made the path visible. You become careful with metaphors because the body treats them like code. If you describe your schedule as a battlefield, muscle tone complies. If you describe it as a studio, breath follows. You test phrases until you find the ones that load the right chemistry. I'm building capacity, I can take one honest step, this is a practice rep, I can return. Language ceases to be decoration and returns to its original function, steering. The spiritual undertone that people sense around silence stops needing labels. It feels like precision without tension, warmth without collapse, agency without aggression. You do not claim special access, you practice reliable access. You can enter the same inner room on command, set initial conditions, and release the need to micromanage outcomes. Outcomes, ironically, improve when you quit chasing them and start tending causes. And in ordinary hours, you keep the craft humble. 3 breaths at thresholds. Shoulders that remember they have a home. Eyes that can widen on cue. 1 sentence in the morning that you can obey without argument. 1 act before noon that proves the sentence. 1 clean closing at night. Repeat across imperfect days until the configuration holds without strain. That is how silence makes potential practical, not by erasing life's noise, but by training you to carry a signal strong enough that the noise no longer runs the show.